The man who sat down across from Micah at that restaurant was the chief executive of the company that signed his paychecks. Micah had been waiting on a blind date for the better part of an hour, and he had run out of ways to arrange the cutlery. So when the chair moved, he looked up, ready to be gracious. Then, he saw the face. He had seen it in the annual report and on a screen at the holiday town hall, a long way up from the desk where Micah spent his days talking furious strangers down off the ledge. There was no possible universe in which a man like that knew a man like him. Whoever had matched them had made a mistake so enormous it was almost funny. And the man across the table had no idea who he was sitting with, so Micah decided to enjoy himself. Then a woman in a dark coat came to the table, bent down, and said something into the Alpha's ear, and the Alpha looked past Micah at somebody across the room, and raised one hand, and sent them home. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now, back to the story. The woman on the phone had been shouting for a good while before Micah said anything at all. Her name was Denise. She lived in a row house in the northeast of the city. A tree had come down on her back roof in a storm, and the company Micah worked for had sent her a letter with the word "excluded" in it 3 separate times. She had already called twice. She had already been transferred twice. She had used a word about Micah's employer that would have made his grandmother put her hand over her mouth, and Micah had let her use it, because people who are still yelling are people who still think somebody might listen. "The tree was not on my property," she said. "The tree was on the property of a man who has been dead for 2 years. "I know," Micah said. "Then why does your letter say I did not maintain it?" "Because the letter is generated off a code, and somebody keyed the wrong code," Micah said. "The letter is wrong. I'm not going to sit here and defend the letter." There was a pause on the line. Micah had learned to love that pause. It was the sound of a person setting down something heavy to see if they were allowed to. "You're the first one who said that. Then the first 3 people you talked to were doing their jobs badly. And I'm sorry about that too." He was already in the file, already pulling the adjuster's notes, already seeing the thing nobody else had bothered to scroll down for. "Denise, can I tell you what I think actually happened, and then you can tell me if I'm wrong?" She let him. He told her. He told her the truth, including the parts that were not in her favor, because the fastest way to lose somebody is to tell them only the half that flatters them. He told her which part of her policy was going to pay and which part was not and why, and he told her what the number would probably be, and then he said the thing he always said at the end, the thing that was not in any script. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're actually angry about the roof." The pause was longer this time. "My husband handled all this," she said. "He did the papers. He would have known what to say to you people." Ninth. "You did fine," Micah said. "You got to me." By the time he hung up, she was laughing about something. And he had already typed the correction into the system and flagged the code error for the team that would ignore it, and his call timer said he had gone over his target by more than double. Micah had been on the complaints floor for years. He was very good at it, in the specific way that nobody puts on a wall. He could take a person at the exact temperature where they were about to say something they could not take back, and he could turn them, and he could do it without lying to them once. His resolution numbers were the best on the floor. His satisfaction scores were the best in the region. His call handle time was, and had always been, a disgrace. The floor he worked on was 8, and 8 was where the company kept the things it did not want to look at. Gray carpet that had been chosen for its ability to hide anything. Headsets. A wall of little partitions with photographs taped inside them, because that was the only decoration permitted. It was a big financial group, one of the biggest in the city. Insurance mostly, homes and cars and small businesses. The kind of place whose name is on a hospital wing and a stadium concourse and the side of a bus. A tower on the parkway with a garden on the roof that nobody on 8 had ever seen. Micah had never been above 12. "You went 11 minutes over on a tree," said Preston, appearing over the top of the partition. Micah took his headset off slowly, because that was the only form of resistance available to him. Preston managed the unit. He was a beta in his 40s who wore a lanyard even though nobody on 8 needed a lanyard. And he had a manner of standing at your shoulder that was both casual and geological. He was not stupid. That was the thing people got wrong about him. He was quite clever. And he had worked out early that the way up in a company that size is not to be good at the job but to be reliably present in the mind of whoever is one level above you. The code on her file was wrong, Micah said. It was going to come back a third time. That is not what I'm measuring. I know what you're measuring. Then hit it, Preston said, and smiled, because he liked to end on a smile. Look, you're good. Everyone knows you're good. But good is table stakes here. I need you to be manageable. He left. Micah put his headset back on and looked at the little photograph taped inside his partition, which was of his mother standing in front of a hydrangea she was extremely proud of, and thought about the word manageable for slightly longer than was healthy. Frankie rolled her chair backwards out of her own partition until she was in his. He said manageable, she said. You were listening. Micah, we all wear the same headset. Of course I was listening. Frankie was a beta. She had been on the floor longer than him, and she had achieved a kind of enlightenment about the place that Micah envied and could not reach. You know what your problem is. I have a list, if you want to compare. Your problem is that Preston needs you to need him, and you have never once in 4 years pretended to need him. That was true. Micah had watched people do it. There was a whole system of it on 8, a soft economy of laughing at the right moment and asking his opinion about a thing you already knew, and saying, "That's such a good point," out loud in a meeting where he had made no point at all. Other people paid into it and drew out of it and got moved to the 12th floor. Micah could not make his mouth do it. Something in him locked every time he tried, and the effort of it left him feeling so grubby that he would go home and stand in the shower and not be able to explain to himself what he was washing off. He had a folder on his desktop that he had never shown to anybody. It was called Voice, which was an embarrassing name he had chosen late at night. Inside, it was a document he had been building for over a year. An actual proposal, with the complaint categories broken down and cross-referenced against the exact wording and the policies that generated them, and a costing, and a projection of what the company was spending on a problem it kept solving one furious phone call at a time instead of solving once at the source. It was good. He knew it was good. He had sent it to Preston twice. He had also put it into the company's internal ideas inbox, which thanked him for his engagement by return and never spoke to him again. He had never once had a meeting in which he could have said any of this out loud. The blind date was Frankie's fault, and Frankie was not sorry. My cousin's friend, she said. Omega, Alpha, whatever you're into. He swears this guy is normal, which in this city is the whole ball game. I'm not doing a matching service. It's not a service, it's a restaurant with a reservation in it. Micah, when did you last eat a meal that somebody else cooked, in a chair, across from a person? He thought about lying and then did not bother, because Frankie could smell a lie from the other side of a room. The truth was that his life had gotten very narrow, without him agreeing to it. Work, then the walk to the train, then his apartment with the radiator that clanked like somebody was being held prisoner in it, then work. He had a savings account with a number in it that was going nowhere. He had a proposal in a folder called Voice that nobody had ever opened. He was 26 years old and he had started to have the specific feeling of a man watching his own life through glass. Fine, he said. Say it nicer. Fine, thank you. I would love to be set up with a stranger from an unregulated cousin pipeline. So on the night in question he put on the good shirt, the one he only wore to funerals and interviews, which told you most of what you needed to know about the last few years, and he went to a place on a corner in the old part of town with warm lights and stamped tin on the ceiling and a bar along one wall. And he sat down at a table for 2, and he waited. The man did not come. He was late. Then he was very late. Then he stopped answering the messages Frankie's cousin's friend had been sending, and by the time the server came around the third time, Micah had reached that particular flavor of shame that is mostly boredom. I can hold the table, the server said kindly, which was worse. Don't hold it on my account, Micah said. Give it to somebody who's actually going to be loved tonight. I'll take the bread and my dignity, and honestly, you can keep the dignity. The server laughed. A few tables away, a man who had just handed his coat to somebody stopped where he stood and turned his head slightly and did not move for a moment. Barrett had not intended to stop anywhere. He had been in a foul mood since the car. The dinner had been arranged by his mother with the thoroughness she brought to everything. A reservation under a name that was not his, a family the group had done business with since before he was born, and an Omega named Emerson who by all accounts was clever and decent, and did not deserve to be a line item in somebody's balance sheet either. Barrett had been told about it in the past tense, which was how he was told about most things. He had spent the drive over composing sentences he was not going to say to his father. Then a voice came across a restaurant, saying something about dignity, and a piece of Barrett's brain that had been asleep for a long time sat up. He knew that voice. He had known it for a long time, and had never once expected to meet it. And he looked before he had decided to look, and having looked he placed the face as well, which was a different and much stranger problem, because Barrett knew who that was. Not personally. Not by any measure the man himself would have accepted. But the group ran an internal award every quarter, a small, stupid thing with a certificate. And it had crossed his desk for signature along with everything else that crossed his desk, and the same name had been on it enough times that he had eventually asked his assistant who it was, and she had told him, and he had looked at the photograph for longer than the moment required, and then gone back to work. The voice was a separate matter, and he had no intention of thinking about the voice in a restaurant. A voice came at his shoulder. Corinne, his assistant, who had come along because Corinne came along. "Your table's the one in the back," she said. "He's not here yet. Traffic on the bridge." Barrett looked at the man sitting alone in the good shirt with the bread he was not eating. There was a version of the evening where he walked to the back and sat down and was pleasant to Emerson for a fixed number of minutes, and went home and let the machine keep running. He had lived inside that version since he was 19. He had been managed, scheduled, matched, introduced, positioned, and put in rooms his entire adult life. And he had gotten so used to the sensation that he had stopped noticing it at all, which is what happens to anybody who lives near a fan. Nobody in that restaurant had put him at that table. "Corinne," he said, "give me a minute." "Barrett, 1 minute." He crossed to the table, put his hand on the back of the empty chair, and said, "Is this seat spoken for?" Micah looked up. It took him a second, because the brain protects you. First, he registered a very tall alpha in a very good coat. Then he registered the jaw and the mouth and the particular gray at the temples that had been on a screen behind a podium at the last town hall, above a slide about disciplined growth. The chief executive of the entire group was standing at his table asking if the seat was taken. Micah's first coherent thought was that he was going to kill Frankie. His second was mathematical, and it arrived with the clean certainty of a bell. There were thousands of people employed by that company. There were hundreds of them in that tower alone. Micah was a voice in a headset on the 8th floor with a resolution rate nobody had ever mentioned out loud. The idea that this man knew his face was so absurd that he discarded it instantly. And what took its place was almost giddy. The service had matched him with his own boss by accident. That was all. Somebody had run a filter and the filter did not know what floor anybody worked on, and now here they were. And the man had absolutely no idea. "It's not spoken for," Micah said. "Apparently nothing about my evening is." Barrett sat down. Up close, his scent arrived all at once and from underneath, like weather coming over a river. Dry hops, green and bitter and clean, and bay leaf, and beneath that a low, dark note Micah could not place and did not have a word for. It was not a friendly scent. It was not unfriendly either. It was the scent of somebody who had learned to keep the temperature of a room by holding still in it. "You've been stood up," Barrett said. "I've been outmaneuvered." There's a difference. Being stood up implies he made a decision. I think he just drifted. "Do you want me to leave?" "No," Micah said, and was surprised by how much he meant it. Something happened in the Alpha's face then. Small, gone almost immediately. Micah did not know it. But it was the first time in a long time that a person had said no to that question and meant it about him rather than about his office. "Barrett," the Alpha said, and put out his hand. Micah shook it. The Alpha's hand was warm and dry, and his grip was a fraction more careful than it needed to be. The grip of a man who has spent his life being told he is large. "Micah. What do you do, Micah?" And here, Micah thought, is where I lie. He did not lie. He got most of the way there, and then some contrary muscle in him refused. The same muscle that had never learned to tell Preston his ideas were good. Customer service, he said. Insurance. Which house? A big one. That narrows it to 9. Then you already know more than most of my dates find out. Micah broke a piece of bread and did not eat it. Let me guess. You're in finance, and you're going to say something modest about it, and I'm going to spend the next while trying to work out whether modest means you own a boat. I don't own a boat. That's exactly what a man with a boat would say. Barrett looked at him for a moment. Then he did something with his mouth that on a less controlled person would have been a laugh, and picked up the water and said, I'm in insurance too. Sort of. I'm on the business side. Ah, said Micah with enormous satisfaction. So you're one of them. It should have gone badly from there. Micah had been to enough of these evenings to know the shape of the bad ones. Instead, something loosened in him, because of a piece of reasoning he was very pleased with at the time, and would think about with horror for months afterward. He was never going to see this man again. The man did not know him. There was no version of the following week in which any of this had consequences. For the first time in years, Micah was sitting across from somebody with absolutely nothing to protect. So he talked. Can I tell you what nobody on the business side understands? He said. Over the first course, please. You think complaints are a cost center. You genuinely do. There is a line in a deck somewhere with our department on it, and it is in red. And every year somebody looks at that line and says, how do we get this number down? And the answer they land on is always the same, which is to make it harder to reach us. That's not fair. It's extremely fair. You put the phone number at the bottom of the 4th page. You made the chat robot ask 4 questions before it lets you through. You know what that does? It doesn't reduce complaints. It just means that by the time somebody gets a human being, they've been holding it in for a week, and now they're not calling about a roof anymore. They're calling about their whole life. And you take that call. I take that call. And I'm going to fix in 9 minutes what the letter broke in 9 seconds. And then a man in a lanyard is going to tell me I went over on handle time. Micah put his fork down. Sorry, you asked. I did ask. I'm being unbearable. You're being specific, Barrett said. It's not the same thing. Micah, who had been told he was difficult by every manager he had ever had, felt something in his chest turn over. He should have stopped there. He did not stop there. There was wine, and there was the reckless joy of talking to a stranger, and there was the fact that the stranger kept asking, quietly, one question after another, like a man opening doors down a corridor to see how far it went. Give me the worst one, Barrett said. The worst one is not a story, it's a category. Somebody's parent dies. The policy is in the parent's name. The kid calls us at the worst moment of their life, and we ask them for a document they cannot possibly have yet. And then our system sends them the same request every 11 days until they either produce it or give up, and a lot of them give up. And we book the ones who give up as a saving. You know that isn't the intent. I know it isn't the intent. Intent doesn't send the letters. Micah shrugged. Our chief executive gets up on a stage and says we're in the business of showing up on the worst day of somebody's life. Great line. Somebody wrote that for him, and somewhere upstairs a rebuild of the automated correspondence engine got signed off with an 11-day dunning cycle in it. And I promise you he has never read one of those letters, because if he had read one he would not be able to sleep. Barrett was very quiet. You've met him, Micah said. Once or twice. What's he like? There was a pause of a length that Micah, in his excellent mood, entirely failed to notice. Managed, Barrett said. That's a strange thing to say about a man who runs a company. It's the truest thing I know about him. Micah laughed and reached for his glass and did not think about that sentence again for a long time. And Barrett, watching him laugh, made a decision he would have called reckless in any subordinate, and simply did not correct him. He told himself several things about it afterward. He told himself the man had been talking about an office, and not about a person. That it was not personal. That correcting him now would end the evening, and humiliate him for nothing. All of that was true, and none of it was why. It was that Barrett had not been talked to like a person in a very long time. Since the day his name went on the wall, he had been handled by everyone he met. People who wanted things were warm at him. People who feared him were careful at him. His father spoke to him in the imperative, and his mother spoke to him in the past tense. And the last person who had told him he was wrong to his face without checking his own footing first had been his grandfather, and his grandfather was dead. And here was a man with bread he was not eating and a shirt that had been ironed too carefully, telling him the truth about his own company, with no idea that he was doing it. It was the most interesting thing that had happened to Barrett in years, and he wanted more of it, and he did not examine the wanting. That was when Corinne came. She crossed the room in the dark coat, bent, and put her mouth near his ear, and Micah, out of pure animal instinct, leaned back an inch to give them room. "He's here," Corinne said. "The back table. Barrett, your mother came with him." Barrett did not look at Micah. He looked past him, across the restaurant, at a young man standing near the host stand in a coat that had cost somebody a great deal. Being shown where to go by a woman with her hand at his elbow. "Send them home," Barrett said. "Send them. Put them in a car, tell them I'm not able to join them tonight, and that I will call in the morning and say so myself. Not you. Me. A beat. Corinne, be kind about it. None of this is his doing." Corinne stood up, took one look at the table, one look at the man sitting across it, and understood the entire situation completely, and never once mentioned it to anybody, which is the only reason the following months were possible. Then Barrett raised one hand, a small flat gesture toward the back of the room, and whatever the gesture meant, it worked. The young man in the good coat was turned around at the host stand. The woman with her hand at his elbow said something sharp to the air, and they went out through the door into the street and were gone. Micah watched all of it and drew exactly the wrong conclusion. "Was that work?" he said. "That was my mother." "You sent your mother home." "I have been trying to do that for years," Barrett said. "Tonight it took." Micah laughed so hard he had to put a hand over his mouth, and across the table the Alpha's scent shifted, opened, let something through it that had not been there before, dark and warm and sweet at the back of the throat, and Micah's own scent answered before he could stop it. He felt it go. That was the humiliating part. It went out of him like steam off a cup. Gooseberry and geranium leaf and the clean soap smell that clung to him from the little bar in his shower at home, and underneath it, unmistakably, the sweet one, osmanthus and apricot, which he could not usually get to come out for anybody at all. He put his hand flat on the table and breathed and got it back. "Sorry," he said. "For what?" "You know for what." "I do," Barrett said. "I'm not going to say anything about it. Thank you. Because if I say something about it, you'll leave. And I would like you not to leave yet." 4. Micah looked at the tablecloth for a moment. Because his face had gone hot, and because he was 26 and had not been wanted out loud in a long time, and because somewhere very deep under the wine and the giddiness, a much quieter voice was saying, "You work for this man. You idiot. Be careful." He told the quiet voice that it did not matter. The night was a fluke, a clerical error, a bubble. By the start of the week, he would be back in his headset, and this man would be in a room on a floor Micah had never seen, and the two facts would never touch again. "All right," he said. "But you're not allowed to ask what I do again. I already know what you do. You know what I said I do. I know exactly what you do," Barrett said, and drank his water, and Micah heard nothing wrong with it at all. Micah spent the weekend in a condition of pleasant amnesia and walked into the building at the start of the week, a happy man. He got his coffee from the machine on 8 that made a noise like a small animal in distress. He said good morning to Frankie, who wanted the entire report and was going to get an edited version of it. He put his headset on. He took a call from a man in the western suburbs who was upset about a fence. In the middle of the morning, the floor went strange. It went strange in the specific manner of a room somebody important has just walked into, which is to say the noise level does not drop so much as change key. Micah, mid-fence, did not look up. Then Frankie kicked his chair. He looked up. The chief executive of the group was standing by the printer on the 8th floor with people trailing behind him, listening to Preston explain something at a volume that had never been necessary in the history of speech. Micah went under his desk. He would like it stated that he did not consciously decide to. His body performed the maneuver on its own initiative, a smooth, folding motion that took him out of sightline and put his forehead approximately level with his own knees. And then he stayed there, in the dust, next to a phone charger he had lost months earlier, listening to a man in the western suburbs describe a fence into a headset he had forgotten he was still wearing. "Sir," said the man in the suburbs, "are you still there?" "I'm right here." Micah whispered. "Tell me about the post caps." Above him, Frankie made a sound like a kettle. From the floor, Barrett saw the top of a head disappear and a chair rotate slowly on its own, and he stopped listening to Preston entirely. He had come down with a reason. The reason was written in his calendar as a site visit to service operations, and it had taken Corinne most of a morning to construct out of nothing, and it was thin enough that anybody who cared to look would see straight through it. He had told himself on the way down that he only wanted to know whether the man was real, that the restaurant had been an evening, that people are different at work, that this would settle it. Then, a grown man in a shirt he had ironed too carefully hid under a desk rather than be seen by him. And Barrett had to turn his head to the window for a moment. He did not call him out. He did not walk over. He listened to Preston for the correct number of minutes, asked 2 questions that were not about anything, looked at a screen he did not need to look at, and left. Micah surfaced when the elevator doors closed. Frankie was scarlet. "You," she said. "Hid. I was retrieving a charger. You hid from the chief executive of the company. There was a charger." "Micah." She wheeled all the way in. "Why?" And this was the moment, obviously, where a sensible man tells his friend the truth. Micah looked at her and thought about the sentence, "I had dinner with him and he did not know who I was, and I spent the whole evening telling him his own correspondence engine is an atrocity," and understood with total clarity that once that sentence existed outside his own head, it would be on every floor of the building within days, and that the version which arrived on 12 would not be the version he had said. "No reason," he said. Frankie looked at him for a long moment. "You're a terrible liar." "I know. It's my best quality." He went home that night light as air, because it was over. A coincidence had happened. It had passed harmlessly overhead, and normal life had resumed. Barrett came back later that week. This time there was no Preston in tow at first, because he came in through the stairwell door at the far end, which nobody in the history of the 8th floor had ever done, and he was halfway down the aisle before anybody registered him. Micah, who had spent days telling himself he was not watching the elevators, was caught entirely in the open with a headset on and half a sandwich in his hand. Their eyes met over the partitions. Barrett did not smile. What he did was slightly worse. He inclined his head barely at all, a nod for a stranger in a corridor, and then he looked away again, and went and stood by the window and asked somebody about call routing. Micah put the sandwich down and discovered that his hands were unsteady. "He does not know," Micah told himself, savagely. That was a nod at a person. He nods at people. He nodded at the man from facilities. By the following week, it had become a thing. The chief executive of the group came down to 8 one week, and again the next. He sat in on a call review, which had never happened in the memory of anybody currently employed there. He asked for the complaint categories broken out by source, which sent 2 analysts into a panic that lasted days. He announced, in an email that went to the whole division and was read aloud in disbelief in kitchens all over the building, that as part of a renewed focus on what he called the actual voice of the customer, he would be spending time each week with the teams who heard it directly. The floor lost its mind. There were theories. Frankie's theory was that the company was being sold and the buyers wanted the complaint book clean. Somebody in the vendor unit was certain it was a lawsuit. Somebody else had heard from a friend in compliance that the regulator was circling, which was closer to the truth than anybody realized, and would matter enormously later. And Preston, who managed the unit, developed a theory of his own. "He's watching me," Preston said, in the weekly huddle, with his hands laced together and his voice pitched at humility. "Look, I'm not going to pretend I don't know what this is. When somebody at that level starts showing up on a floor, it's about succession. It's about who's ready." Frankie's chair creaked. "So what I need from all of you," Preston said, "is for this floor to look like a floor that is ready." What that meant in practice was that the gray carpet got shampooed, that everybody's partition photographs were reviewed for appropriateness, that a whiteboard appeared with the word excellence on it in Preston's handwriting, and that Preston himself began wearing a different suit and appearing, with uncanny reliability, wherever Barrett happened to be standing. He walked him to the elevator. He walked him to his car once. He started sentences with, "As I was saying to Barrett," in meetings on other floors. Micah, meanwhile, developed a system. The system had rules. When the stairwell door opened, he went to the supply room. When the elevator chimed, he took a call. Any call. Immediately. Because a man with a live customer on the line cannot be spoken to. When neither was available, he walked, at a pace that he felt was natural, and that Frankie described as the pace of a man leaving a bank. It worked for a while. It was, in fact, a very good system. Then Barrett had Corinne put a meeting in the diary called Complaint Handling Deep Dive, and had her invite a handful of people from the floor by name. And one of the names was Micah's. The room was on 12, which meant Micah had to take an elevator to a floor he had never had a reason to visit. And the carpet up there was a completely different color, and there was a plant that was almost certainly real. He had spent the night before constructing a plan. The plan was to sit at the far end, say nothing that could be attributed to him, and leave. He had gone so far as to practice a facial expression in the bathroom mirror, an expression of mild professional attentiveness, which Frankie had informed him made him look like a man being questioned by police. Barrett was already there when he came in. So was Preston, who had taken the seat at Barrett's right hand with the confidence of a man who has been rehearsing a moment for weeks. "Sit anywhere," Barrett said to the room. Micah sat as far away as the table permitted, and the Alpha's scent found him anyway, dry and green and bitter across the polished surface, and the back of Micah's neck went warm and stayed that way for the next hour. It should have been survivable. It was survivable right up until the middle of it, when somebody from the analytics team put a slide on the screen showing complaint volumes by driver, and Barrett looked at it for a while and said, "This is measuring the wrong thing." The room did what rooms do. It agreed enthusiastically and asked what the right thing was. "I don't know yet," Barrett said. "That's why I'm here." And Preston, smoothly, said, "If I can jump in, this is something I've been looking at for a while, actually. The way I'd frame it is that we're treating each complaint as an event, when really it's a symptom. What we should be doing is mapping the complaint back to the specific policy wording that generated it." Micah stopped breathing. "Go on," Barrett said. "So you'd cross-reference the categories against the source language," Preston said. "And you'd cost the recurrence, and you'd find that a small number of clauses are producing an enormous share of the volume. Fix the clause. Kill the complaint. It's a change at the source rather than at the switchboard." It was Micah's document. It was not similar to Micah's document. It was Micah's document, in Micah's order, including a phrase about the switchboard that Micah had written late at night and been quietly proud of, and it had been sitting in the shared drive for days because Preston, having ignored it twice in his inbox, had suddenly wanted it somewhere he could take a look at it and give it some polish. Micah sat very still and looked at the table and understood, with the flat calm that arrives after the worst has already happened, that there was nothing whatsoever he could do about it in that room. If he spoke, he was a junior person calling his own manager a thief in front of the chief executive. There was no sentence available to him that did not end in his own destruction. He had been in that position before. Twice, in fact, in this building. He knew what it felt like, and he knew how long it took to stop feeling like anything. At the head of the table, Barrett said, "That's a good frame. Thank you. Where's the costing?" "I'm still refining the costing." "How far along?" "Fairly far." "Then send it to me tonight," Barrett said pleasantly, and moved on. And the meeting went its way. And afterward, everyone stood up and made the noises people make. Micah was almost at the door when Barrett said, without particular emphasis, "You didn't say anything." The room was still half full. Micah turned around and produced his police interview face. "Nothing to add," he said. "You had a great deal to add. That's not really my call to make." "Isn't it?" "No," Micah said. And it came out with more edge than he intended, and he watched the edge land, and could not entirely regret it. "There's a way things go here. I'm sure that's less obvious from where you're standing." Then he left, and got in the elevator, and pressed 8, and stood in the corner with his heart going, and told himself with complete conviction that the man had no idea who he was. Barrett got the costing late that night. It was very good. It was also, he noticed immediately, written by two people, because a document has a voice, the same as a person does, and the introduction had been typed by somebody who used the phrase, "at the source," and "the switchboard," and a very particular kind of joke about dunning letters, and the covering email had been typed by somebody who did not. He read it more than once. Then he sat in his kitchen in a house that was much too big and thought about a man saying, "There's a way things go here." He could have fixed it in a phone call. That was what he did with problems. A phone call, a name moved, a line restored, an obstacle taken quietly out of the road, and nobody ever knew it had been there. He picked up his phone and put it down, and did not call anybody, and would spend a great deal of time later wishing he had understood then why he had hesitated. Instead, he did something worse and much more enjoyable. The message reached Micah at the weekend, sent back down the same chain of cousins and friends that had produced the date in the first place, and by the time it got to him, nobody in the chain could say for certain where it had started. "The man from the restaurant would like to see you again. Same place, Thursday, if you're free." Micah read it, standing up in his kitchen, and then had to sit down on the floor. There were, he decided over the following hours, only two possibilities. The first was that the chief executive of the group had recognized him at that dinner, had allowed him to spend the evening insulting the company's correspondence engine, and now wanted a second one, which was insane. The second was that the man had no idea, had enjoyed a pleasant evening with a stranger who worked in insurance somewhere, and had asked to see him again, which was merely terrifying. He went with the second, because he wanted to, and because the alternative required him to believe he was interesting enough to be a target. He went anyway, which was information about himself that he did not care to examine. Barrett was there first this time, at the same table, and stood up when Micah came in, and Micah discovered that having somebody stand up for him did something to his knees. "You came," Barrett said. "You asked. Remind me what you do again." Micah, halfway into his chair, looked up. There was nothing on the alpha's face. Nothing at all. Polite, mild, slightly curious. The expression of a man being introduced at a party to somebody he has definitely met before and cannot for the life of him place. Something in Micah's chest gave a small, undignified drop. "Customer service," he said. "Insurance. Right. Yes. You don't remember. I meet a lot of people. Of course you do." Micah unfolded his napkin with great precision. "That's fine. I imagine there's a rotation. A rotation. You strike me as a man with a lot of Thursdays." And Barrett, who had not been able to think about anything else for weeks, who had read that man's writing over and over in his own kitchen at a table built for more people than he ever invited, who had asked Corinne to move a board briefing so the evening would be free, looked at him with total neutrality and said, "It's possible. It was a cruel thing to do, and he knew it was cruel, and he did it anyway, because the alternative was telling the truth, and the truth would have ended the whole thing right there. And because there was a small, unlovely, starving part of him that wanted to see whether it would sting. It stung. He watched it sting, and then he watched the man across the table gather himself up, decide not to care, and become funny about it. And Barrett understood that he was in a great deal of trouble. They stayed until the staff started turning chairs up on the far side of the room. Micah did not talk about work that night. He had decided early on that if the man could not be bothered to remember him, then the man was not getting the good material, which lasted until the bread arrived and then collapsed entirely, because Barrett asked him what he had wanted to be when he was younger, and then actually waited for the answer. "A translator," Micah said. "Of what?" "Anything." That was the appeal. I liked the idea of being the person in the middle. Somebody says a thing badly in one language and you hand it over in the other language, said well, and now two people who were about to have a fight are having a conversation instead. He turned his glass around. "I went to a state school, and then my mother got sick in my second year and I came home, and by the time that was finished the languages were gone and there was a job on a phone, which, when you think about it, is the same job with worse pay. Is she all right now? She's got a hydrangea she talks about more than she talks about me." "That's a yes. That's a yes." Barrett said nothing for a moment. And Micah, who had been braced for the noise people make about mothers and illness, found the silence unexpectedly restful. "What about you?" he said. "What did you want to be?" "I don't know." "That's a non-answer." "It's the answer." Barrett turned his own glass a quarter turn, the first fidget Micah had ever seen out of him. "I got told what I was going to be early enough that I never got around to wanting anything else. By the time it occurred to me to ask the question, it was a strange question to ask, like asking a bridge whether it enjoys the river. That's a horrible thing to say about your own life." "Probably." "No, I mean it. That's genuinely bleak. You can't just say that over the entree. And Barrett laughed. Actually laughed. Out loud. Once. A rough, surprised sound that clearly did not get out often, and 2 tables looked over, and Micah sat there in the wreckage of his own composure and thought, oh no. Outside, afterward, it had turned cold. Micah had brought the wrong coat, because he had spent a long time on the shirt and no time at all on the rest of it, and he stood on the corner with his hands jammed in his pockets doing an unconvincing impression of a man who was fine. Barrett took his own coat off and put it around him. It was not a smooth gesture. That was the thing that undid Micah. He clearly had no practice, and he did it too fast, and the collar caught on Micah's ear, and he said sorry under his breath and fixed it with 2 fingers, and then he did not step back. They were very close. Micah could feel the warmth still in the lining. He could smell the whole of him now. No restaurant, no food, no other people. The hops gone soft and the bay leaf and that low, dark sweetness rolling up underneath it. And this time Micah recognized it. Molasses. It was molasses. The smell of the bottom of a jar. And it was not there when the man was in control. You should get in the car, Barrett said. His voice had dropped. That's your car. It can be your car. It goes where I tell it. That is such an obnoxious sentence. It's the truth. That's what makes it obnoxious, Micah said, and did not move, and neither did the Alpha, and the space between them got very small and very warm. And Micah's own scent came up out of him again, sweet now, no hiding it. The whole street could have had it. Barrett's hand came up and stopped short of his face. Micah watched it stop. He watched the fingers close on nothing and go back down to his side. And he heard the man breathe in once, very carefully, like somebody who has decided in advance that he is only having one. Not tonight, Barrett said. I didn't ask. You didn't have to. That's presumptuous. Yes, Barrett agreed. And Micah wanted to hit him, and also wanted several other things, and stood on a cold corner in a coat that was far too big for him, holding on to the front of it with both hands. Why not tonight, he said. There was a pause that Micah would think about later with a completely different understanding of what had been happening inside it. Because there's something I have to tell you first, Barrett said. And I keep not telling you. Then tell me. Not on a street corner. That's very dramatic. It's very cowardly, Barrett said. There's a difference, and I'm on the wrong side of it. He put Micah in the car. He gave the driver the address without asking for it, which Micah did not notice at the time and would remember later with a jolt, and he stood on the pavement in his shirt sleeves in the cold and watched the car until it turned, and then he went home and sat in his kitchen and did not sleep. At work it got harder, not easier, because now the Alpha was on 8 almost every week, and Micah had to be in the room, and the room was full of other people, and the 2 of them had to perform a thing they had never agreed to perform, which was strangers. Barrett was good at it. He had a lifetime of practice at being pleasant to people at a distance. Micah was terrible at it, and got worse, because he discovered that his body had opinions that his brain had not been consulted about. The man walked past his partition and Micah's scent went up like a flare, and he would have to sit there with his ears burning, praying that the only 2 Alphas on the floor were both on calls. Once, in the stairwell, they were alone for the length of one flight. Neither of them said anything. Barrett came down, Micah went up, and at the turn of the landing Barrett stopped, and Micah stopped, and there was a moment in which the whole thing very nearly went off in the middle of a fire stair with a laminated evacuation notice on the wall. Micah's back was against the rail. Barrett's hand was on the rail beside him, not touching him, close enough that Micah could feel the warmth off his knuckles. This is a bad idea, Micah said. Which part? All the parts. I don't even know what I'm calling a part. Micah. It was the first time he had said the name at work, and it went through Micah like a struck string, and his scent bloomed so hard and so sweet that Barrett shifted, one long, slow lean toward him that stopped before it arrived, and the dark note came off the Alpha in a wave that made the air in the stairwell taste of something burnt and sweet. Then a door opened, 2 floors down, and somebody's voice said something about a parking permit, and Barrett went down the stairs and Micah went up, and neither of them said a word about it for weeks. The thing that broke it open was a piece of paper, which is how these things usually go in companies. The costing had gone up to Barrett under Preston's name weeks before. And what came back down? In its own time, the way everything in that building came down was an instruction that the work be prepared for the executive committee, with a supporting appendix, by the end of the month. Preston received this news like a man receiving a medal. Then he discovered that the appendix required somebody who could actually do the analysis. And he came and stood at Micah's shoulder with his hands laced together. "I want you on this," he said. "This is your chance to be part of something. It's my document." Preston's face did not change at all. That was the frightening thing about him. There was no flicker of shame, because there was nothing in there for shame to catch on. "It's the unit's document," he said, "and I would be careful about how that sounds." So Micah built the appendix, at night, on his own time, because there was no other way for the thing to be right. And one afternoon, Preston was in a meeting on another floor, and somebody upstairs wanted the file, and there was nobody else to carry it. "Take it up yourself," said the analytics woman. 40. His office. Corinne will sign for it. Micah had never been to 40. The elevator took a long time and opened on a corridor with a floor that made no sound. And there was a woman at a desk who looked up and said, "You're from 8. I've got the appendix. He's expecting it." Corinne looked at him for slightly too long, with an expression he could not read. "Go in. He's on his own." The door was not quite shut. Micah put his hand on it and stopped, because there was a voice coming through the gap. It was his own voice. It was thinner than he thought of it, and younger, and it was saying, patiently, "No, I'm not going to read you the clause. If I read you the clause, you're going to argue with the clause. I want to talk about what actually happened." And then a man's voice, wrecked, saying something Micah could not hear. And then his own voice again, quieter, saying, "For what it's worth, I don't think you're actually angry about the roof." Micah pushed the door open. Barrett was standing at the window with his back to the room and his phone in his hand and the recording still going, and the room was full of the sound of a conversation that had happened years ago, and on the desk between them was a coat Micah had returned by courier, and which had apparently never made it to a closet. Barrett turned around. Neither of them said anything for a while. Micah's ears were roaring. "That's me," he said. "Yes, that's a call. That's an old call. Why do you have a call? Sit down." "No. Micah, do not do that." His hand was shaking on the file. He put the file on the desk so it would stop. "Say what it is." So Barrett said it. "In my first year in this chair, my father had a stroke," he said. "He recovered. He came back. But for a while nobody knew that. And I was running a company I had been handed rather than given. And I could not sleep." He stopped there for a moment. "I did something I have not told anybody. I pulled a live claim file out of the system. One of ours. A denial. I had the whole thing in front of me, so I could answer anything they asked me to prove. And I called our own complaints line at night and said I was the customer. You what? To hear what we sounded like from the other side." Barrett's voice was extremely level, which Micah had learned by then was the sound of him holding something. "That is the reason I give when I say it out loud. It is not the reason." The pause went on long enough to be uncomfortable for both of them. "There was nobody I could call. That is the whole of it. There is a number on the back of our own paperwork, and somebody answers it at any hour. And I used it. I have never said that sentence before, and I would prefer not to say it again. You got me. I got you. How long was that call?" "Long," Barrett said. "You told me the letter I was holding was badly written. Then you told me which parts of it were true anyway, which was worse." He put the phone face down on the desk. "You would not let me be right about the parts I had wrong. And at the end of it, you said something I have thought about since. Calls are recorded. I pulled it. I have listened to it more than I am going to say in this room." A pause. "I never looked at who took it. The system would have given me the name in one click, and I did not click it, because I did not want to be a man who looks people up. So for years, it was a voice and nothing else." Micah stood in the middle of the carpet with his heart going like a bird in a box. "That was years ago," he said. "Yes. And at the restaurant." Barrett did not look away. Whatever else the man was, he did not look away. "I knew who you were before I sat down," he said. The room went very quiet. "Say it again." "I knew who you were. I knew your name." He said it in order, flat. A man getting through a list he had written out in advance. I have signed a certificate with your name on it every quarter for 2 years. I asked Corinne who you were and she told me. And then in that restaurant I heard the voice first. Before I saw anything. And I knew the voice. And I turned round and the face was the one off the certificate. Those had been 2 separate things in my head for years. They stood up and became one person, a few tables away, with a piece of bread he was not eating. He stopped. I sat down knowing exactly who you were, and you told me you worked in customer service at a big house, and I let you. I told you, Micah said, and had to stop because his throat had closed. I told you about the letters. I told you what I thought of the chief executive. I said he'd never read one. I said he wouldn't be able to sleep if he had. I said it to your face. You did. And you sat there. I sat there, Barrett said, because it was the first true thing anybody had said to me in a very long time, and because if I had stopped you, you would have stood up, and I did not want you to stand up. That is the entire reason. There is nothing better underneath it. And the second one, when you said, "Remind me what you do," something moved in the Alpha's face. That was cruel. Yes, it was. I have no defense for it. I wanted to know whether it would matter to you. He said it plainly, without any attempt to make it sound better than it was. It's the sort of thing a man does when he has never once in his life been able to tell whether he is being liked or handled. Micah looked at him for a long moment, and then he did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was terrible. The site visits, he said. The deep dive. The voice of the customer. Yes. You built a whole program. I built a whole program. To come and look at me. Yes, Barrett said. Do you know what that means for me? Micah's voice went, and he let it go. Because there was no point saving it. You get to have a reason. You're the man on the wall. Nobody asks you why you're on a floor. I'm a person with a resolution rate who has been in the same seat for years, and if one person in this building ever puts those 2 facts side by side, my whole life is a story about who I sat down with in a restaurant. I know. You do not know. You have never once in your life had to be careful. Barrett took that. He stood there and took it, and did not defend himself, and that was almost worse. Every good thing that has ever happened to me, Micah said. I got by being the only person in the room willing to say the unpopular sentence. That is all I have. It's not much, and it is mine, and I have spent weeks now walking into rooms with you in them, and I have to know, and I am asking you straight, and if you lie to me I will find out. The costing that went upstairs, the meeting that got made, any of it. Was any part of that about him? Which part are you asking about? You know exactly which part I'm asking about. Barrett was silent. Micah waited. He waited long enough that the waiting became its own answer, and then he picked his file back off the desk, because it was his, and walked out. He did not come to the apartment that night, which Micah had expected, or the next, which he had not. He came on the 3rd night, in the rain, without a car, which meant he had walked from somewhere, and he stood in the doorway of a building with a broken buzzer, and said, I'm going to answer the question now. Micah let him in because the neighbors were listening. The apartment was small and Barrett was not, and the 2 facts had a conversation with each other for a moment. He stood in the middle of the floor with rain in his hair and looked at the radiator that clanked, and the one good chair, and the photograph of a woman in front of a hydrangea stuck to the fridge with a magnet from a pizza place, which was the same photograph that was taped inside a partition on 8. A thing Barrett noticed and did not mention. Answer it, Micah said. I did not make that meeting happen for you. The deep dive was real, the work is real, the problem is real, and I would have gone looking for somebody like you eventually. Barrett wiped the rain off his face with the flat of his hand. But I did one thing. Your document came to me under another man's name, and I could tell it was written by 2 people. And I told Corinne to find out who wrote the first half, and when she told me I said that whoever built the appendix would be named on it when it went to committee. I gave that instruction before I asked you to dinner the second time. Micah stood with his arms folded. So you did do it. I did that. I have not done anything else, and I will not. And I understand that you are entitled to think that is one thing too many. It is one thing too many. I know. You don't get to just take a hand off the scale after you've already leaned on it, Micah said. That's the part you're not hearing. If it comes out that my name went on that appendix because you said so, then every hour I spent on it is gone. It doesn't half count. It goes to 0. Barrett stood there, dripping on a rug that had come from Micah's mother's hallway. Then, tell me what you want, he said. I mean it. Say it, and it happens. That's the problem. That sentence right there. You genuinely do not hear what's wrong with it. I don't, Barrett said. That is entirely true, and I would like to learn. And that, in the end, was what did it. Not an apology. Micah had received apologies from men in that building before, and they were all beautifully constructed and none of them cost anything. This was a man standing in a rented kitchen saying, I don't know how to do this, out loud, in front of somebody who could have made him small with it. Take the instruction back, Micah said. Tell Corinne you changed your mind about the naming. If my name goes on it, it goes on because Preston has to put it there when somebody asks him a question he can't answer. That may not happen. Then it doesn't happen. Barrett looked at him for a long moment. You would rather have nothing that was given to you than something that was. Yes. Why? Because I have watched what happens to people who take the gift, Micah said. There's a woman on my floor who got moved up because a manager liked her. And she is good. She's very good. And there is not one person in that unit who believes it, including her. She's been carrying it for years. I would rather be stuck than carry that. Something went over Barrett's face that Micah could not read, and later understood had been recognition, because there was a man in that building who had been handed his own chair and had never once been able to tell whether he deserved to sit in it. All right, Barrett said. I'll take it back tomorrow. Thank you, Micah. What? There is something I want that is not in your gift, and I'm going to say it badly. Then say it badly. I have spent my life in rooms where everyone is calculating, Barrett said. I know what people want off me within about a minute. It has made me useless at almost everything else. And then a man in a shirt he had ironed too carefully told me my company's letters were an atrocity and did not want one thing from me, and I have not had a single clear thought since. He stopped. He seemed genuinely annoyed with himself. That's it, he said. That's what I had. Micah crossed the kitchen and took a handful of the front of his wet shirt and pulled. It was not graceful. Their mouths met at the wrong angle and Micah's nose bumped his jaw and neither of them cared at all. Because on the second try it went right. And then it went very right, and the alpha made a low sound against his mouth that Micah felt in his back teeth. Barrett's hands came up and stopped, still not touching, hovering. You can, Micah said against his mouth. Say it properly. You can touch me, you enormous coward. So he did, and Micah was walked backward until the counter caught him. And then lifted, actually lifted, hands under his thighs, set on the edge of it with no visible effort at all, and that did something to Micah's dignity that he was not going to recover from. The alpha's mouth went off his mouth and along his jaw and down to the hinge of it, and stopped where the neck begins, and breathed there. Micah's scent went up so fast that the kitchen filled with it, the sweet note coming with it this time without being asked, and the answer came off Barrett in a wave, the hops gone soft, and the whole dark bottom of it opening. Molasses and something scorched, and where they met it made a third thing that was neither of them. Micah caught it, and could not name it for a second, and then could. It was the taste at the end of a bitter drink, when whatever has been sitting at the bottom of the glass finally comes up sweet. Oh, Micah said, out loud, like an idiot. I know. Is that us? That's us. Micah put both hands in his hair and pulled his mouth back where he wanted it. Barrett's fingers found the hem of his shirt and went under it, spread flat and warm across his back, and there was a moment where Micah's whole spine arched into the palm of a hand like something answering a question, and the sound he made was not a word. Then Barrett stopped. His forehead came down on Micah's shoulder and he stayed there, breathing, with his hands not moving at all. And it took Micah a moment to understand that the shaking he could feel was not his own. Not tonight, Barrett said, into his shirt. You keep saying that. You spent 3 days deciding whether I had bought you something, Barrett said. If we do this tonight, that question comes back at 4 a.m, and it takes you apart. I would rather want you for another week than be the reason you have to ask yourself that. Micah sat on the counter with his fingers still in the man's hair and understood, with an unpleasant lurch, that he was in significantly more danger than he had realized. That was almost a good answer, he said. I've been working on it in the rain. How long were you outside? A while. You walked here. I did not want a car of mine parked outside your building for an hour, Barrett said. And then, because he was learning, which is its own kind of insult, and I'm sorry for it. What followed was the happiest stretch of Micah's adult life, and it was conducted almost entirely in secret, and both of those facts turned out to matter. They had rules. Micah wrote them, on the back of an envelope, and Barrett agreed to all of them with a seriousness that Micah found both infuriating and dangerously attractive. Nothing in the building, no cars sent, no restaurants where anyone from the group ate, no gifts, and when Barrett tested this by having a box of very good coffee turn up at the apartment, it went back the same day with a note that said, "Nice try," in Micah's small square handwriting, and Barrett kept the note. So it happened in the city instead. It happened in a Vietnamese place, under a rail bridge, where the owner did not read the business pages. It happened on a bench by the river at the weekend, with terrible coffee, arguing about whether the man had ever in his life taken a bus. It happened in a cinema on a weeknight, where they watched something neither of them could later describe, because Barrett had his hand around Micah's wrist on the armrest the entire time, thumb moving slowly over the scent gland there, and Micah spent the entire film with his ears on fire, pretending to follow a plot. Micah learned things. He learned that the man could not cook and would not admit it. He learned that he read every night, actual paper books, and that he had a habit of reading a line out loud when he liked it, to nobody, an old solitary habit that Micah found unbearably sad the first time and then simply loved. He learned that Barrett's phone rang constantly, and that he had begun, at some point, to look at the screen and put it face down. He learned that a man who has spent his life being handled has no idea how to be touched. The first time Micah kissed him hello without warning, in a doorway, the alpha went completely still. And then his hand came up and closed around the back of Micah's neck like a man catching something falling, he said. Later, in a voice he clearly hated the sound of, that nobody had done that to him in longer than he could account for. Micah did not say anything about it. He just made a point, from then on, of doing it every time, and he learned what the dark note meant. It came up whenever the man's controls slipped, and Micah began collecting the occasions like a scientist. It came up when Micah laughed at something. It came up when Micah won an argument. It came up hard. The night Micah fell asleep against him on a couch and woke to find that Barrett had not moved in over an hour and had let his arm go numb rather than shift. Then the cycle came around. Micah knew it was coming, because he had been tracking it since he was 15 and because he had the pharmacy reminder in his phone. He was on suppressants, the regular kind, the kind that hold a heat off as long as you take them on time and eat something with them and do not let yourself get run down. He had been on them since he started the job, because a call floor is not a place where you can afford to disappear for a week. He got run down. It was the appendix. He had been building it at night for weeks and eating like a student, and the preheat arrived early, and it arrived at work, which is the nightmare every omega on a suppressant carries in their coat pocket. He felt it start in a meeting on 12. It began as it always did for him, with his own skin becoming aware of his shirt, and then the light in the room getting too bright, and then a wave of warmth up the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the temperature. He got out. He got to the stairwell and sat down on the landing with his head against the cool wall and did the arithmetic of how many hours until he could get to a pharmacy and how far the walk was to the train and whether he could do the walk. The stairwell door opened. "Don't," Micah said to the floor. "It's me. You cannot be here. There's nobody in this stairwell," Barrett said, and crouched down, not close, an arm's length off, hands on his knees where Micah could see them. "Tell me what you need, not what's convenient. What you need. I need my prescription, which is at a pharmacy near my apartment, and I need to not be seen leaving this building looking like this." Right. What happened next took very little time, and Micah, in the state he was in, could only follow parts of it. There was a service elevator he had not known existed. There was a loading dock and a plain car with a driver Micah had never seen and would never see again. There was Corinne, appearing from nowhere, saying, "I have a coat," in the tone of a woman who has had a coat ready for some time. And there was Barrett, in the back of the car, sitting all the way against the far door with his hands flat on his own knees, as far from Micah as it was physically possible to be inside one vehicle. You can move over, Micah said, some distance into the drive. No, I'm not that far gone. You're far enough gone that you just told me to move over, Barrett said. And I want you to remember tomorrow that I didn't. Micah put his head back against the seat and laughed, and it came out wrong. And the Alpha's hand tightened on his own knee until the knuckles went pale. And the whole car filled up with the smell of him, because a man's control is a thing with edges, and Micah was leaning on all of them. At the apartment, he took the pills and drank the water and got under a blanket, and the fever came up and broke, and came up again, and broke lower. Which is what a preheat does when you catch it in time. And Barrett stayed. Not in the bedroom. He sat in the one good chair in the other room with the door open and a book he did not read, and every so often he brought a glass of water in and put it on the floor by the bed and went out again. Sometime in the night, Micah said hoarsely. This is humiliating. Why? Because you're in there being a saint and I'm in here being an animal. Micah. A pause. I have been in this chair for 6 hours and I have not read a single line of this book. Nobody in this apartment is a saint. There are 2 of us in here and only one is being sensible, and it isn't me. Because if I were sensible, I would have gone home. Then why didn't you? The chair creaked. Because you shouldn't be by yourself for this, Barrett said. And because the last time you were, there was nobody to ask. Micah lay in the dark with his arm over his eyes and thought, I am going to be in love with this man, in the flat tone of a person reading a diagnosis. In the morning the fever was down and the pills had it and the whole thing had cost him a day. Barrett was asleep in the chair with his neck at an angle that was going to cost him a week. Micah stood in the doorway in a blanket looking at the most powerful man he had ever met, sleeping badly in a chair from a second-hand shop. And something in him that had been braced for years quietly let go. He did not say any of it out loud. What he said, when the man woke up, was, Your car is going to have to come and get you, because you look like a hostage. Good morning to you too, Barrett. Thank you for sitting all the way over by the door. Barrett rubbed his face. Don't thank me for that, he said. That's the floor. That's not a favor. That's the floor. The executive committee met on 40 in a room with a table that had been made from a single tree, and Preston went into it in a new suit with his slides in order, and Micah sitting behind him against the wall in the seat they give to people who are there in case a number is needed. For the first stretch, it went beautifully. Preston was good at the front of a room. He had the voice for it, and the pauses for it, and he said, at the source rather than at the switchboard, and let it land. Then the chief operating officer put his pen down. Warner ran everything that was not sales. He was an alpha in his 50s with a scent like cold vinegar and an air of permanent, mild disappointment, and he had been in that building a great deal longer than Barrett had been in the chair, a fact he was able to communicate without ever mentioning it. Your recurrence model, he said. You've assumed the clause fix removes the complaint entirely. Why? Because the complaint is generated by the clause. The complaint is generated by the letter. The clause generates the letter. If you fix the clause and the correspondence engine still fires on the old code, you get the same letter and a fixed clause, and no change in volume at all. Warner looked at his page. So which is it? Are you modeling the clause or the code? There was a silence in the room of a quality Micah had never heard before. Preston said, The model accounts for both. How? It's in the appendix. I've read the appendix, Warner said. It's the only part of this that is any good. I'm asking you to explain page 4 of it. And Preston turned around. He turned around and looked at the wall, at the seat where they put the person who is there in case a number is needed. And he said, in a voice that had gone thin, Micah can speak to the detail. Micah stood up. He had imagined this moment. He wants it noted that in the imagined version he had been much cooler about it. In reality, his hands were freezing and he had to put the file down on the chair. And the first sentence came out too fast, and he had to stop and start again. And then he was fine, because it was his and he knew it like his own street. He explained page 4. He explained why the model split the two, and where the Dunning cycle came in, and what happened to the number if you fixed only the clause, which was nothing, and what happened if you fixed only the code, which was worse than nothing, because the letters stopped and the underlying denial did not, and then people found out later and by then you had lost them. And how do you know that? Warner said. Because I have taken those calls. Micah said. Both kinds. They don't sound the same. Warner looked at him for a while. Who wrote this? He said. The room stopped, and at the head of the table, the chief executive of the group, who could have ended the whole thing with one sentence, sat back in his chair and said absolutely nothing, and looked at the tree they had made the table out of. I did, Micah said. The frame is mine. The costing is mine. The appendix is mine. Preston built the deck. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Warner made a small note on his page, and the meeting moved on. And that was all. And it was everything. The program was approved before lunch. It came with a name, which Micah hated, and a budget, and a small team, and a reporting line that went to 12 rather than to 8. Weeks later, he was offered the lead of it, in a letter that came from Human Resources with Warner's name at the bottom, and not one word of it had been arranged by anybody who had ever seen him in a bad shirt. He read it more times than he needed to, standing in a stairwell. Then he called his mother. They gave you a team, she said. They gave me a team. Are you crying? No, Micah said, crying. He did not tell Barrett until that evening. And when he did, he found that he had wanted, badly, to be able to say the sentence out loud to somebody who understood exactly what it had cost, and that there was only one person on the planet who qualified, and that he could not say it in any room where anyone could see him do it. So he said it in a car park under a supermarket, of all places, and Barrett listened to the whole thing without interrupting once, and then said, I have never wanted so much to be allowed to be pleased in public. You didn't help, Micah said. In the room. You let it go all the way to the wall. You not have. That was the hardest hour of my working life. Thank you. Don't thank me for that, Barrett said, and Micah laughed. Because it had become a joke between them, and neither of them heard the crack running under the floor. Preston went quiet. That was the part Micah should have noticed. Preston did not shout, did not sulk visibly, did not make a scene. He simply became extremely pleasant, and started saying good morning. And one afternoon he asked Micah about his weekend with an interest so warm and so total that Micah answered vaguely out of pure instinct. What Preston did was pull records, because a unit manager with a certain grade of access can pull a great deal. And because he had noticed something months earlier that had lodged in him like a splinter. He had noticed that the chief executive of the group came to the 8th floor, and that one man on that floor was never in his seat when he did. So Preston went looking. He found the day Micah left early, and he found the car log, and he found that a plain car had been booked out of the executive cost center on that date, and he found the drop address, and the drop address was not in any file Preston had any business being in, but it was in a file, because Micah had filled in an emergency contact form when he joined, and had never updated it. He printed it, and then he took it to the only person in the building with a reason to want it. Warner listened to all of it without changing expression, and asked one question, which was whether Preston had told anybody else. And when Preston said no, Warner said, Good, don't. Then Warner put it in a drawer and waited. Because Warner had a proposal of his own coming to committee, and it concerned the outsourcing of the entire complaint handling function to a vendor in another state, and a newly funded internal program with a good business case and a photogenic young lead was extremely inconvenient to it. He brought the paper out on the morning of the vote. The outsourcing paper was called Service Delivery Optimization, and it ran to a considerable number of pages, and the number at the back of it was very large. Micah was in the room, because the program he now ran was one of the things being optimized. He had prepared for a fight about numbers. He had his own pages. He had rehearsed the argument in the shower for a week, and he was, for once in his life, walking into a room he had a right to be in. Warner presented the case. It was a good case, if you accepted its terms. The unit was expensive, the vendor was cheap, the satisfaction scores would fall, and the paper said so honestly. And then it said, in the tone of a man reading out a train time, that the falls were within tolerance. Within tolerance of what? Micah said. Of the regulatory threshold. So the target is to be as bad as we are permitted to be. The target, Warner said, is to be efficient inside the envelope we are given. I appreciate that this unit has an emotional case. That is why I have not brought the emotional case into this room. Bring it in. I would rather not. No. Bring it in, Micah said. Because if there's an argument in this building about my unit that I'm not allowed to hear, I would like to hear it. There was a small silence in which Micah, who had spent his working life being able to read a room better than anybody in it, read that one perfectly and far too late. Very well, Warner said, and opened a folder. He did not say anything vulgar. That was the craftsmanship of it. He laid out a car log, and a date, and an address, and he noted that the address matched the personnel file of the employee who had authored the business case supporting the program under review, and that the vehicle had been drawn against the office of the chief executive, and that he raised it purely because the committee was being asked to weigh a business case, and the committee was entitled to know how that case had come to be in front of them. Then he said, "I have one question for the chair. Was any decision affecting this employee's position taken by you personally?" And Barrett said, "Yes." Micah's ears went to a high ringing sound. "Once," Barrett said, "before the program existed, I instructed my assistant that whoever built the appendix would be named on it when it reached committee. I withdrew that instruction the following day. He asked me to." "You withdrew it?" "I did." "Is the withdrawal documented?" "Yes." "So there is a document," Warner said, "in which the chief executive of this group first directs that a junior employee be credited, and then rescinds it. And then some months later that same employee is running a funded program that competes with a proposal from my office. And there is a car. That was all he had to do. He did not have to draw the line. Everyone in the room drew it themselves, which is what makes that kind of thing so hard to fight, because there is nothing to deny." Micah stood up. He had no plan. What came out of him was small and true and not remotely a speech. "I answered his phone call," he said. "Nobody understood, obviously. He heard how it sounded and could not fix it. Years ago. Before any of this, he called our line and I did not know who he was and I did my job, and that is the whole beginning of it. He was aware that his voice had gone. He kept going. The numbers in that case are mine. Ask me anything about them. Ask me right now, in front of everybody, and if I can't answer it, then throw the whole thing out." "That will not be necessary," Warner said, not unkindly, which was the worst part. The vote was deferred pending review. That was all that happened. In the end, no decision was taken about anything. It was around the building by the afternoon. Micah walked back onto 8 to collect a file, and the floor did the thing floors do, which is not silence but a change in key, and he heard his own name from behind a partition in a voice that stopped when he came around the corner. Somebody would not look at him by the coffee machine. Frankie found him in the supply room and shut the door. "Tell me it's not true." "Which part?" "Micah, it's true," he said. "The part that's true is that I'm with him. The part that isn't true is all the rest of it, and I already know that doesn't help." Frankie put both hands over her face. When she took them down, she was not angry, which he could have handled. She was sad. "They're saying that's how you got the unit." "I know. I told them." I said, "No. I sat next to him for years. That man built the whole thing at night. I watched him do it." She shook her head. "And you know what they said to me? They said, 'Well,' she would say that." Micah leaned back against the shelving with the cleaning supplies and shut his eyes. There it was. The exact thing. He had said it out loud in a rented kitchen in the rain, months ago, to a man who had been dripping on his mother's rug, and it had arrived anyway. It doesn't half count. It goes to 0. Preston found him at the elevator on the way out and did him the courtesy of saying it to his face, which Micah almost respected. "You know what I can't get past," Preston said. "You're the one who thought he was better than the rest of us. You wouldn't laugh at anybody's jokes. You wouldn't put in the work of being pleasant. And it turns out you were just doing it the shorter way. That's not what happened." "Doesn't matter what happened," Preston said. "You know that better than anybody. You've spent 4 years telling people it's not what the letter says, it's what the letter does." The doors opened. Micah got in and rode all the way down on his own. That night, Barrett came to the apartment. He came furious, which Micah had never seen and hoped never to see again, and it was not the shouting kind, it was the other kind, the kind that arrives very quiet with a plan. "Warner is finished," he said. "By the end of the week. The paper is dead. The review is dead. I'll take the whole function off him and put it under the chair, and I will make a statement to the division. No. Micah, listen to what you just said. Micah was standing by the window with his arms crossed and had been standing there for over an hour. Every single one of those sentences starts with I, because I am the only person in that building who can do any of them. I know. That's the problem. That's the whole problem, and it has been the whole problem since the first night. He turned around. If you fire Warner over this, then for the rest of my working life, I am the man who got a chief operating officer removed for saying a true thing out loud. If you put out a statement, then the statement is the thing people remember, and the statement is written by you, about me. Do you understand? Every fix you have makes it worse, because every fix you have proves the story. Barrett stood in the middle of the room with his hands open at his sides. Then what do I do? Nothing. I can't do nothing. You have never done nothing in your life, Micah said. You do not know how, and I can't be the thing you practice on. He had not known he was going to say that until it was out, and he watched it land. And it landed exactly where it was aimed, which is how you know a sentence has come out of the real place and not the fighting place. I'm resigning, he said. Don't. It's already written. Micah, if you walk out of that building, they will say he was let go. Then they'll say it, Micah said. They're going to say something. At least this one I chose. And Barrett, who had never once in all his years of running things been unable to solve a problem with a phone call, stood in a small apartment with his hands open and could not think of one single thing to do. He did not leave that night. That was the part nobody would have believed, and it was the worst part. They sat on the floor with their backs against the couch and did not touch for a long time. And then did, and Barrett put his face in the side of Micah's neck and stayed there, breathing him in, and Micah held onto the back of his shirt with both fists, and there was nothing sweet in it at all. It was the other thing. It was the thing that happens right before. Say it, Barrett said, into his neck. Whatever it is you're not saying, say it now, because I would rather have it than not have it. Say it. 1. So, Micah said it. From the first minute in that restaurant, you have known more than me, he said. Every single time. You knew my name, and I didn't know you knew. You knew you'd heard my voice, and I didn't know there was a recording. You had already put your hand on the scale before I even knew you were in the room, and every time I found something out, you told me the truth about it, and you told me kindly, and it was always after. Yes, I'm not saying you're a liar. You could. I'm saying I have never once been in this with the same information as you. Not one day of it. And I have spent my whole working life being the person who doesn't get told things, and I let myself think this was the one place I wasn't that. Barrett did not defend himself. He did not say the thing that was true, which was that he had told him everything in the end. He heard the actual charge, which is rarer than people think. I did that, he said. I know you did. What do you need? I need to be somebody again, Micah said. Somewhere where nobody has ever heard of you. And I need you not to arrange it. Not the job, not the reference, not a phone call to a friend, not a quiet word. Nothing. If I find out later that you touched any part of it, that's the end. And it won't be a fight. I'll just be gone. That is the hardest thing anyone has ever asked me for. I know. That's how you'll know it's the one that counts. He left in the morning, and neither of them said the word ending, and both of them understood that something had been put down that might not be picked back up. Barrett's father came to the office days later, which he had not done since the stroke. Roland was 81 and walked with a stick he did not need, and had founded the company out of a storefront office with 2 desks in it, and he sat down across from his son and looked around the room as though checking whether the furniture had been moved. You're being talked about, he said. I know. There's a family that has been good to this company for a very long time. Their boy is a serious person. He was turned around at a host stand and they have been extremely gracious about it. I'm not doing that. I have not asked you to do anything. Roland put both hands on the head of the stick. The board meets in the spring. There are people on it who would like something steady to look at. That is the entire content of my visit. Say the rest of it. There is no rest of it, his father said. That is what steady means. Barrett looked at the old man for a long moment, and thought about a bridge and a river, and said, "Did you ever ask me?" "Ask you what?" "Anything," Barrett said. "In my whole life. Did you ever ask me one thing and wait for the answer?" Roland considered this with the seriousness he brought to a balance sheet. "No," he said. "I decided early that you were capable, and after that it did not seem necessary. That's the worst thing anybody has ever said to me. It's the best thing I have ever said about you," his father said, and got up and went out, and neither of them understood the other at all, which was not new. The weeks after were not dramatic. That is the thing about the worst stretches. They are mostly admin. Micah moved back into his mother's house for a while, which at his age was its own small death, and slept in a room with a poster he had put up as a teenager and could not now remove because the paint would come with it. He applied for things. He got interviews. Some of them. And in every single one there came a moment where somebody said, "So why did you leave?" And he had to decide in real time how much of the truth to hand a stranger, and the versions he tried all made him sound like either a liar or a fool. He took a temporary job at a call center that handled overflow for a utility, which paid less than the one he had left, and had a metric on the wall in red numerals, and for the first week he was so good at it that a supervisor asked him what he was doing there, and after that he stopped being so good at it, and just got through the days. He talked to his mother, who did not ask about the man for a good while and then asked once, "Was he kind to you?" "Yes." "Did he know what he was doing?" "No," Micah said. "Not for a second, and he kept doing it anyway, which is either the best or the worst thing about him, and I still can't tell." His mother nodded at the hydrangea through the window. "Your father used to fix things," she said. "That was the whole of him. Broken tap, he'd be under the sink before you'd finish the sentence. Took me years to work out that when I was upset, and he went and got the toolbox, he wasn't ignoring me. He just didn't have another door in the house. That's very generous of you." "It isn't generous at all. I used to throw things at him." She sipped her tea. "I'm only saying it because you've got the same face on you that I had. It's not whether he's only got the one door. Love. Everybody's only got the one door. It's whether he ever went and looked for another. And Barrett, in the meantime, did the hardest thing available to him, which was nothing. He did not call. He did not send anything. He stopped a car once at the end of a street in a suburb and sat in it for a while and then told the driver to go on. He went into his rut alone that season, which he had done every season of his adult life and which was unbearable for the first time, and he spent it in a house that was much too big, with the phone in another room, and when it broke he came out of it looking so bad that Corinne canceled everything for days without asking him. He read the personnel file. Once. Then he closed it and did not open it again. And that small act of restraint was, by some distance, the most difficult professional thing he had ever done. And then, because he had promised not to arrange anything, and because there was still a company with a hole in the middle of it where a complaint function used to be honest, he started doing the only work that was left to him, which was the work he could not do with a phone call. The letter that changed it came from the state, on paper, with a seal. The insurance department had opened a market conduct examination into complaint handling, which is a dull phrase for a serious thing, and it had been coming for longer than anybody at the group realized, because a regulator does not decide to look at you in a week. It looks at your file for a long time first. The thing that had put the file on somebody's desk was a pattern in the correspondence. A repeating cycle of demand letters going out to people who had recently lost somebody, and the examiners wanted to understand how the cycle had been set and who had approved it and what the company had known. They asked to speak to current and former staff. Micah got the call at the utility call center, standing in a stairwell that smelled of other people's lunches, and said yes before he had time to be sensible about it. He was in that room for a long morning, with a court reporter and 2 examiners and a lawyer for the company who was not allowed to speak for him. He had thought he would be afraid. He was, for the first bit, and then somebody asked him a plain question and he answered it plainly, and that turned out to be the whole job. He did not make a speech. He had nothing to make a speech with. He described the letters. He described what people said on the phone when they got the third one. He was asked whether he had ever raised it internally, and he said that he had, in writing, more than once. And the examiner asked to see it, And he sent it that afternoon from his mother's kitchen table on a laptop with a cracked screen. He was asked, at the end, whether he believed the company had intended harm. "No," he said. "I think a lot of people made small, reasonable decisions in different rooms, and nobody was ever in a room where you could see all of them at once. That's not an excuse. It's just what it was." 1. He did not know, walking out, that he had given the examination the only thing it did not already have, which was a witness who was not angry. What he also did not know was that the company had already handed the examiners a package nobody had asked for. Barrett had done it early in the separation, against the advice of the general counsel, against the advice of every person he had ever paid for advice. He had given them the whole correspondence engine, the approval trail, the dates, and his own signature on the rebuild, which was on it because he had approved it in his first year in the chair without reading what it did. He had not softened his own part. There was a paragraph in that submission which said, in effect, that the chief executive had signed a document he had not understood and that the consequences of it had been visited on people at the worst moments of their lives, and the general counsel had asked him more than once to take it out. Then he had gone to the board and made a proposal, and it had taken all day. The complaint function came out from under the chief operating officer and out from under the chair. It went to the board's conduct committee, on a charter, with its own budget line that could not be moved without a board vote, and an outside firm to verify its numbers every year. Warner did not lose his job, which surprised people, and lost the only thing he actually cared about, which was the function. And into that charter, at the chair's insistence, went one clause that the committee found so strange they asked him to explain it twice. The chief executive of the group would have no involvement, direct or indirect, in any appointment, promotion, compensation decision, or performance review within the unit, in perpetuity, and any attempt by him to influence one was to be reported to the committee. "You are asking us to write a rule against yourself," said the chair of the conduct committee. "Yes. Why?" "Because I am the only person in this company nobody can say no to," Barrett said. "And there is at least one person who has paid for that." Then he sat back down, and the last item that day was the one his father had put on the agenda, which was described as Chair's Personal Arrangements. And Barrett said, in front of all of them, that there would be no announcement in the spring, or at any other time, that he was not available to be matched. That he understood the board might consider this a failure of stewardship, and that if it did, his resignation was on the table, and they should take it. Nobody took it. That is what happens when a company has just handed a regulator its own throat, and the market has not moved. The room simply moved to the next thing, which Barrett found, on the whole, insulting. The examination closed months later. The finding was bad but not fatal. The fine was large but survivable. And the corrective order required the company to stand up an independent complaint handling function with published metrics, which the company was able to point out it had already done, which is the sort of thing that gets called good governance when it is really just a man who could not sleep. The conduct committee needed somebody to run it. The search was run by an outside firm. There were interviews. There was a panel with 2 board members on it and nobody from the executive floor. Micah found out about the role as everybody else did, which was that it was posted, and he sat at his mother's kitchen table and looked at it for a long time and did not apply. He applied a week later, after a competitor offered him a job. That was the part he would keep, afterward, out of all of it. He went to the interview with an offer in his pocket from a company that had never heard of any of this, which meant that for the first time in his working life he walked into a room in that industry as a man who could leave. He was asked why he had resigned. He told them exactly what had happened, in order, including the part that made him look worst, and one of the board members wrote something down. The committee came back at the end of that week. He read the letter twice, and then he called the outside firm and asked them one question, which was whether the chief executive of the group had been involved in the process at any stage. The woman on the other end laughed. "He's contractually barred from it," she said. "There's a clause. It's the strangest clause I've ever seen in a charter." "Since when?" "Since before the search started," she said. "Months before. He did not go to the building. He went to the house, which he had never once been to, and which turned out to be exactly as bad as he had imagined. A great pale thing set back from the road with a hedge in front of it and no life anywhere on the outside. Barrett opened his own door, which meant nobody else was in there. He had lost weight. That was the first thing. The second was that he stood in the doorway and did not say a single word, because he had spent months teaching himself not to reach for a thing, and the muscle he had built for it was now in his way. "I got the job," Micah said. "I know. I found out this morning, from an email that goes to the whole company. Was that hard?" "It was the best morning I've had since you left," Barrett said. "And I sat in a meeting through all of it, and could not tell anybody. So, yes." Micah stood on the step with his hands in his pockets. "I'm not here about the job. All right. I'm here because I have a question. And I've been carrying it around for months, and I want to ask it standing up." He took a breath. "Why didn't you call?" "Because you told me not to. That's not a reason. You've never done a single thing you were told not to do in your whole life." "That's true," Barrett said. He looked at the hedge rather than at Micah. "Every time I picked the phone up, I noticed I was about to do it for me. None of those calls made anything better for you. They made me feel less unbearable, which is not the same thing, and I knew it was not the same thing while I was reaching for it." He stopped. "I have done that to you before. In a restaurant, on a second Thursday, with a car log, every time telling myself it was for you. So I sat in the house and let it be unbearable. And that is the first thing I have ever done for you that cost me anything." Micah looked at the hedge for a while. "Come in," Barrett said. "Or don't. But there's something in here I've been keeping, and it's yours, and I would rather you took it either way." It was a folder. It was on the table in the hall, and it had been there. Micah understood immediately, for a long time. "What is it?" "Everything," Barrett said. "Every decision I ever made that had your name anywhere near it. In order, with the dates, the certificate signatures. The day I asked Corinne who you were, and what I said, and what she said back. The instruction about the appendix, and the withdrawal of it. The night I gave a driver your address without asking you for it. The evening I asked a restaurant who had booked that table, so that I could get a message to you. The car booking, the recording, and the date I pulled it, and every date I listened to it, because the system logs that, and I have not made the list look better than it is. There are things in there you don't know. There is one thing in there that is going to make you angry." "What?" "Read it in order." Micah put his hand flat on the folder and did not open it. "You said it on the floor of your apartment," Barrett said. "That you had never once been in this with the same information as me." He stopped. He had clearly had the rest of it in some order, and the order had gone. "It took me longer than it should have to work out what you were actually saying. You never called me a liar. Not once. And you had the material. You were telling me that from the first minute you were in a room with a man who had the advantage, and that I kept it. Because keeping it was pleasant. And then I kept keeping it. Right up until I could not." "Yes," Micah said. His voice had gone. "That's it. That's exactly it. I made you funny for me in that restaurant. You thought you were safe. You were not safe. I let you go on being that way because it was the best evening of my life, and it did not occur to me until a long time afterward that you were paying for it, and I was not. Keep going." "That is the whole apology," Barrett said. "There is no second half where I explain myself. I have been given everything I have ever had, and it turned me into somebody who thinks you love a person by handing them things quietly and never saying so. You are the only one who ever handed one back. I would like to learn it off you, if there is any of it left." Micah opened the folder, at the front, and read the first page. It was a photocopy of an internal certificate, the small, stupid thing with the seal on it, dated years earlier, and in the corner, beside a signature Micah had a copy of in a drawer at his mother's house, somebody had written one word in pencil, which was, "him." He looked at it for a long moment. Then he closed the folder and put it back down on the table and said, "I'm going to read all of that. Later, properly, with a drink, and I'm going to be furious about at least one page of it." "You are, but I'm not doing it tonight." "Micah." "Barrett," Micah said. I have spent months at my mother's house sleeping under a poster of a band I no longer respect, and I have a job that is mine, and a clause in a charter that means you can never do one single thing for me again as long as we both work there, which is either the most romantic thing anyone has ever done or a sign that you need help. And I have not been touched by anybody since the rain. Barrett crossed the hall and got his hands on him and lifted him clean off the floor. Micah's back hit the wall and a picture came off it, and neither of them looked to see what it was. His legs went around the man's waist without any instruction from him at all, and the alpha's mouth was on his and then under his jaw and then at his throat, and the sound Barrett made against the skin, there was not anything like control. The whole hall filled with it. Hops gone soft, and molasses coming up dark and sweet from the bottom, and Micah's own scent going up to meet it, and the third thing arriving between them so strong that Micah heard himself say something that was not a word into the man's hair. "Say it," Barrett said, against his neck. "Say the thing you're going to say, because I have been listening for it for months. You first." "That is such a coward's answer." "I know," Micah said, "and I'm still waiting." Barrett pulled back far enough to look at him. His hands were shaking. Micah felt it through his thighs, and it did something to him that no amount of restraint had ever done. "I love you," Barrett said. "I have loved you since a night I spent lying to a stranger about a roof, and I did not know it was you until a restaurant, and I have made an idiot of myself about it in every direction available to a man with money. That's a very good list." "Micah, I love you," Micah said. "I loved you in the rain, and I was furious about it. Take me upstairs before I say something worse." He did. The cycle came around in its own time, months later, and Micah came off the suppressants on purpose, which he had not done since he was a teenager, and told his team he would be out, and did not explain why, because he did not have to anymore, because he had rewritten the unit's leave policy himself and had put in language a person could actually use. He spent the first day of it in a nest he had built out of a duvet, and both of the man's coats and a shirt that had gone missing weeks earlier and turned up, mysteriously, exactly where a person would put a shirt if they wanted somebody to find it. Barrett was there for all of it. He did not leave the apartment once. He brought water and cold cloths and food that arrived from somewhere because he still could not cook, and he sat on the floor by the bed with his back against the frame and his hand loose around Micah's ankle for hours at a stretch, saying almost nothing, letting himself be held onto. When the worst of it came up, Micah asked. He asked in the middle of the night with his fingers in the man's collar, and Barrett said no, and Micah said please. And Barrett said no again, and put his forehead against Micah's and stayed there while it went through him. "Not while you're like this," he said. "That's the only time it works. You know that's the only time it works. Then ask me at the end, when it's coming down and you can still count backwards from 10. If you want it then, you'll have it, and I will never once have to wonder." Micah said something extremely rude into his shoulder and fell asleep against his chest. He asked again at the end, on the last day, sitting up on the edge of the bed in one of the coats, hoarse and clear-headed, and counting backwards from 10 out loud with great sarcasm. And Barrett said yes. It was quieter than Micah expected. That was the thing nobody tells you. The alpha's hands came up and turned his head to the side with more gentleness than a man that size ought to have, and there was a breath at the gland at the base of his neck. And Barrett said his name once, asking, and Micah said yes, and then there was a bright, hard flare, and the sound Micah made was not embarrassing at all, because there was nobody in the world left to be embarrassed in front of. Afterward, he lay against the man's chest in a bed that had been comprehensively destroyed, with his ears ringing. And something came in that had not been there before, low down and steady and other, like a second set of footsteps in a house you thought you were alone in. "Are you doing that?" Micah said. "Doing what?" "Never mind. I can feel you being smug. That's going to be a problem." "It is going to be a considerable problem," Barrett agreed. "The unit is a real thing now. It has its own floor, which is 11, and it publishes its numbers every quarter whether they are good or not. And the first quarter they were not good, and they published them anyway, and a journalist wrote a piece about it that the group's communications department hated. Frankie runs the quality side of it, because Micah hired her on the first day and had to fight the outside firm about it and won on the evidence. Which is a sentence he still enjoys. Preston is not there. He was moved sideways during the reorganization and then moved sideways again, which is how large companies say things they cannot put in writing. And the last Micah heard, he was doing well somewhere else, and telling people he built the complaint program from the ground up. Micah found that he did not mind at all, which surprised him more than anything else that year. Warner and Micah have lunch about twice a year, at Warner's suggestion, which nobody in either of their lives has ever been able to understand. He is a difficult, precise, faintly disappointed man who was right about the model and wrong about almost everything else, and Micah has learned more from him than from anybody except the woman with the tree. They are careful, still, in the building. There is a clause, and there is a register, and there is a paragraph on a website with both their names in it, which they wrote together and hated the whole time. People know. Nobody whispers, mostly, because the numbers come out every quarter with an outside firm's name on the front, and there is nothing left to whisper about that survives a look at the page. And on an afternoon like any other, on the 11th floor, a call comes through on the escalation line that the new people cannot settle. Micah puts the headset on, because he still takes them, one afternoon a week, which is in his contract because he put it there. It is a man whose mother died in the spring, and who has been sent the same letter 3 times, and he has gotten past being angry and into the quiet part, which is the part that frightens Micah more. "I'm not going to read you the clause," Micah says. "If I read you the clause, you're going to argue with the clause. Tell me what actually happened." Behind him, through the glass, the chief executive of the group goes past on his way to somewhere else, and slows for barely a step, and does not stop because he is not allowed anywhere near that floor's business, and has signed a document saying so. Micah does not look up. He raises one hand off the desk, a small, flat gesture, without turning around, and the man in the corridor, who spent his whole life sending people away with exactly that motion, laughs out loud in an empty hallway, and keeps walking. The end. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the story, tell me your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you.